What if the person you love had to prove their worth just to be with you? Sounds unfair, right? But in a world where wealth and power dictate trust, some people don't take chances. Eleanor Sterling, a billionaire matriarch, built an empire with her own two hands, and she's not about to let just anyone walk into her family. So when her daughter Juliana announces her engagement to Naomi, a woman Eleanor has never met, she does the unthinkable. She goes undercover as a maid in her own mansion to test Naomi in ways no one should ever have to endure. But here's the question. What happens when the one being tested refuses to break? This story will shock you, challenge what you believe about love, trust, and power, and leave you questioning everything by the time you reach the end. Stay with me, because what happens next, no one saw coming. The sky over Montgomery Heights churned with restless clouds, swollen and dark, pregnant with the weight of an impending storm. The wind howled through the towering mansions and perfectly manicured streets, rattling the high iron gates that separated the elite from the rest of the world. Thunder cracked like the universe itself was splitting in two, and within moments the heavens opened, releasing a torrential downpour over the city of wealth and power. Inside the grand Sterling estate, a fortress of old money and modern influence, Eleanor Sterling stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window of her study, a glass of deep red wine resting untouched in her manicured hand. She watched the rain lash against the glass, listened to the rhythmic pounding of droplets against the stone balcony, but her mind was far from the storm outside. Her thoughts were locked onto something far more unsettling. Her only child, Juliana Sterling, had announced her engagement earlier that evening over a private dinner. It was supposed to be a celebration, an intimate affair between mother and daughter, a toast to love and new beginnings. But as soon as the words left Juliana's lips, Eleanor had felt a tightness in her chest, an unease curling in her stomach like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Juliana was in love, and the woman she had chosen was Naomi Carter. Eleanor had never met Naomi, never heard her name before tonight, and yet, the moment her daughter spoke of her fiancé, there was something in Juliana's voice, something raw, something real, that made Eleanor feel as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She set the wine glass down on the mahogany table beside her, exhaling slowly. Juliana was intelligent, sharp, unapologetically ambitious, everything Eleanor had raised her to be. But love had a way of blinding even the most logical minds, and in their world, money didn't just attract love, it attracted opportunists. Eleanor had spent decades building the Sterling Empire from the ground up. She knew what it meant to be a woman, a black woman, navigating a world that wasn't designed for her success. Every dollar, every investment, every contract signed was a battle won, and she hadn't fought this hard to let her family's legacy fall into the hands of someone unworthy. She needed to know who Naomi Carter truly was, not through surface-level charm, not through Juliana's adoring words. She needed to see her when no one was watching. Lightning sliced through the sky, illuminating the room in a sharp, blinding flash. Eleanor's reflection in the window flickered. A powerful, commanding woman, draped in a silk robe the color of onyx, her rich brown skin glowing in the dim candlelight. She reached for her phone and tapped the screen. "Get me on the line with Margaret," she instructed, her voice calm, unwavering. Margaret Pierce had been the Sterling estate's head housekeeper for over 20 years. She was the gatekeeper of the household, the one who trained every employee who walked through those doors. "I need a favor," Eleanor continued, already picturing her plan unfolding. "I need you to hire someone new." A pause. "A new maid?" Margaret asked, confusion lacing her tone. "Yes." Eleanor's lips curved slightly, though there was no amusement in the gesture. "A new maid named Ella James." Silence stretched between them before Margaret finally exhaled. She had known Eleanor long enough to recognize when her employer had made up her mind. "Understood," she said simply. Eleanor ended the call and turned back toward the storm. This wasn't about controlling Juliana's life. This was about protection. She had watched too many powerful people be brought down by those who wore love as a disguise. Too many fortunes lost to hands that never knew the weight of earning. If Naomi Carter was the woman Juliana believed her to be, she would prove it. And if she wasn't, well, Eleanor Sterling never left anything to chance. The soft hum of sewing machines filled the small tailor's shop in downtown Montgomery Heights, a place where the city's elite rarely stepped foot. The space smelled of fabric, dust, and years of quiet resilience, where old money wouldn't dare touch, but where those who understood the art of reinvention came to disappear into something new. Eleanor Sterling sat still in front of a full-length mirror, watching as the seamstress adjusted the hem of the dull gray maid's uniform around her waist. The fabric was rough against her skin, a stark contrast to the silk and tailored perfection she was used to. She didn't flinch. The disguise was necessary. Her usual presence, powerful, sharp, commanding, was being stripped away, layer by layer. Gone were the luxurious fabrics, the diamonds that glistened at her wrists, the sleek waves of her hair sculpted to perfection. Instead, her curls were pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun at the nape of her neck. Her nails, usually painted in deep, sophisticated shades, were filed down and left bare. The minimal makeup she always wore was wiped away, revealing the natural warmth of her skin, untouched by the polish of wealth. By the time the seamstress stepped back, Eleanor no longer looked like Eleanor. She looked ordinary. And that was the point. "Will this do, ma'am?" the older woman asked, tilting her head. Eleanor met her gaze in the mirror, a small smirk curving her lips. Perfect. That evening, a storm loomed on the horizon as Eleanor arrived at the Sterling Estate's back entrance, this time as Ella James. The servants' entrance was a place she had never stepped through in her own home. The heavy wooden door was scratched with years of use, the metal handle cold beneath her fingers. It smelled different here, like lemon cleaner and fresh linens, not imported perfumes and expensive leather. The air was filled with the soft murmurs of staff exchanging hurried instructions, the sound of pots clanking in the kitchen, the distant hum of vacuum cleaners preparing the mansion for the evening. No one looked at her twice. It was a strange thing to become invisible in your own kingdom. "Ella James?" A sharp voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Margaret Pierce, the estate's head housekeeper, standing with her arms crossed. Margaret was in her late 50s, a woman of discipline and sharp instincts. She had been running the Sterling household for decades, and in that time had never once questioned Eleanor's authority. But tonight, Eleanor was no longer the woman in charge. She was just another maid. Margaret studied her with careful eyes, then jerked her chin toward the long hallway leading into the depths of the mansion. "Follow me." Eleanor nodded once and fell into step behind her, her heart steady but her mind racing. The servant quarters were tucked away at the rear of the estate, far from the opulent guest rooms and grand living spaces. The ceilings were lower, the floors lined with simple wood instead of marble. Though clean and well kept, there was no excess here, no velvet curtains, no gold-trimmed mirrors, no chandeliers dripping with wealth. Eleanor's fingers twitched at her sides. It had been decades since she had been in a space like this, not since before she became Eleanor Sterling. Margaret led her into a modest room where a few other maids were gathered, folding linens, their movements practiced and efficient. "This is Ella James," Margaret announced to the group. "She's new. Show her how things are done." One of the younger maids, a woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile, stepped forward. "I'm Liza. You've worked in a house like this before?" Eleanor's response was smooth. "A few." Liza nodded approvingly. "Good. Just keep your head down, do your job, and stay out of the family's way. Mrs. Sterling doesn't like mistakes." Eleanor almost laughed. Mrs. Sterling, if only they knew. As the evening stretched on, Eleanor adjusted to her role as Ella. She carried trays, wiped down surfaces, and folded endless amounts of linens, all the while keeping her ears open, her eyes sharp. She was searching for Naomi Carter. She had only seen a photograph, a simple, candid shot that Juliana had sent her earlier that day. Deep brown skin, high cheekbones, a radiant smile that seemed to carry a quiet strength. But a picture wasn't enough. She needed to see Naomi in motion. And then, just as she was setting a tray of glasses onto the long dining room table, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floors caught her attention. Eleanor turned her head slightly, careful not to seem too interested. And there she was, Naomi Carter. She was even more striking in person, tall, poised, moving through the grand hallway with a quiet confidence. She wasn't draped in designer labels, nor was she dripping with the hunger of someone eager to belong in this world. She was simple, elegant, herself. Eleanor watched as Juliana appeared beside her, laughing at something Naomi had just said. Their hands brushed briefly, a small, intimate touch that spoke of something deep, something real. For a moment, something inside Eleanor wavered, but she shook it off. She hadn't come here to be charmed by Naomi Carter. She had come to test her. And before the night was over, she would. The air inside Sterling Estate was thick with the scent of polished wood, fresh-cut flowers, and the faint trace of vanilla from the candles flickering in the grand chandelier. It was the kind of place where whispers carried, where everything gleamed under soft golden light, where wealth didn't just exist, it announced itself in every carefully curated detail. And yet, for the first time in her life, Eleanor Sterling wasn't meant to be seen. Standing quietly in the corner of the vast dining room, dressed in her modest maid's uniform, she observed the scene unfolding before her with the sharpness of a hawk. Naomi Carter had arrived, the woman who had captured her daughter's heart, the woman who, for all Eleanor knew, was an opportunist, a gold digger, someone who had perfected the art of looking effortless in places where she did not belong. Naomi stood at the entrance of the room, her skin rich like mahogany under the warm glow of the chandelier. She carried herself with a grace that didn't feel forced, a quiet poise that made her presence known without demanding attention. Her dark curls were pulled into a loose bun, a few strands framing her face, and her dress, simple yet elegant, flowed effortlessly as she moved. She wasn't overdressed. She wasn't trying too hard. Eleanor narrowed her eyes slightly. That could mean two things. She was either genuine, or she was incredibly calculated. Juliana appeared at Naomi's side, beaming in that rare way she did when she felt truly at ease. It was the look of someone deeply in love, too in love to see the potential cracks beneath the surface. The moment Naomi stepped further into the room, Eleanor shifted her posture, straightened her back just enough to observe without drawing attention. And then, just as she had planned, she made her first move. As she carried a silver tray stacked with delicate porcelain teacups, Eleanor took a slow, deliberate step forward. The slightest shift of her wrist sent the top cup teetering to the edge. It was barely a second, a fraction of time where she could have caught it, but she let it fall. The sharp crash of ceramic shattering against the pristine marble floor cut through the soft murmur of the room. A hush fell over the space. Eleanor's shoulders sank slightly as she bent down, making herself small, something she hadn't done in years. Her voice, normally steady and commanding, came out softer, just above a whisper. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her fingers barely brushing against the broken pieces. This was the moment. How Naomi Carter reacted to something as simple as a maid's mistake would tell Eleanor more than 1,000 rehearsed conversations ever could. Would she ignore it? Would she look uncomfortable, maybe glance at Juliana to do something about it? Would she show irritation, impatience, that flicker of superiority that so many in Eleanor's world wore like a second skin? But Naomi did none of those things. Instead, before Eleanor could blink, Naomi knelt down beside her. "It's okay," Naomi said softly, her voice carrying none of the irritation Eleanor had expected, none of the detachment. And then, she reached out and started picking up the broken pieces with her own hands. Eleanor froze. Naomi, in her perfectly pressed dress, her carefully chosen jewelry, was kneeling on the cold marble floor, her fingers brushing against shards of ceramic, helping a maid clean up a mess that wasn't hers. Eleanor stole a glance upward. Juliana was watching, smiling slightly. But she wasn't surprised, because this was normal for Naomi. Eleanor could feel the weight of the room pressing in. A wealthy guest wouldn't have done this. A social climber wouldn't have risked a cut to their hand. And yet, here was Naomi, collecting the sharp fragments with careful fingers, like this moment mattered just as much as any conversation with the elite. Eleanor swallowed down the tightness in her throat. She should have felt satisfied. Her test had been passed, hadn't it? But instead of relief, something else settled in her chest. Doubt. She didn't like it. So she forced herself to remain in character, bowing her head slightly as she whispered, "Thank you, miss." Naomi simply smiled, setting the last piece onto the tray before standing. "Of course," she said. "It's just a cup." And just like that, she was gone, walking back toward Juliana as if the moment hadn't been anything significant. But for Eleanor, it was. She sat there for a second longer than necessary, staring at the delicate fragments in her hands. Naomi Carter was not what she had expected, but that didn't mean she was ready to let her guard down. Not yet. The air inside Sterling Estate carried a certain weight, one that only those accustomed to power could recognize. Every room was curated to perfection, from the hand-carved mahogany furniture to the antique chandeliers dripping with crystal. Even the silence was carefully managed, existing in that delicate space between luxury and control. Eleanor Sterling had designed this home to be untouchable. Yet tonight, sitting in the grand dining hall disguised as a simple maid, she felt like an intruder in her own kingdom. She had spent the past few hours observing Naomi Carter, watching her movements, measuring her interactions with Juliana and the household staff. So far, the woman had passed each unspoken test: kindness, patience, humility. But people could be deceptive. A single good deed meant nothing if it wasn't consistent. Eleanor needed to be sure, so she decided to push just a little further, and this time she wouldn't make it easy. The fire crackled softly in the grand fireplace, its golden glow casting long shadows against the dark wooden panels of the dining room. Juliana and Naomi sat at the long table, deep in conversation, lost in their own world. Eleanor stood a few feet away, a silver tray balanced carefully in her hands, the delicate teacups rattling slightly as she approached. Perfect. She slowed her pace just enough for her foot to slip. The tray tilted, the porcelain teapot wobbled, and before she could catch it, a stream of hot tea splashed over the table, spilling directly onto Naomi's lap. Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor froze, wide-eyed, as if horrified by her own mistake, the perfect image of a flustered, overworked maid. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, miss," she stammered, reaching for a napkin, her hands deliberately unsteady. This was the moment. Would Naomi lash out? Would she recoil in disgust, snap at Eleanor for her incompetence, maybe even demand that someone fire her on the spot? Would the mask slip? Eleanor held her breath. But then Naomi laughed. Not a forced chuckle, not a tight, uncomfortable laugh meant to mask irritation. A real, genuine laugh, the kind of laugh that disarmed people. "It's okay," Naomi said smoothly, dabbing at the tea-stained fabric of her dress with the napkin Eleanor had handed her. "It's just tea, just tea." Eleanor clenched her jaw slightly. She had expected discomfort, irritation, even the smallest flash of superiority. But Naomi wasn't flustered. She wasn't even mildly annoyed. If anything, she looked amused. "Are you all right?" Juliana asked, reaching out instinctively, concern flickering in her eyes. Naomi smiled, shaking her head. "I've had worse. Remember last summer, when I spilled an entire bottle of red wine on myself at that gala?" Juliana groaned at the memory. "Don't remind me. I spent half the night trying to find a dry cleaner in Manhattan." Naomi grinned before turning her attention back to Eleanor, and that was when something unexpected happened. She reached out, touched Eleanor's hand, not in pity, not in condescension, but in reassurance. "It was an accident," Naomi said gently. "Really, don't worry about it." Eleanor swallowed. She had meant for this to be a test. Instead, it had turned into something else entirely, a moment of warmth, of grace. She had met countless people in her life, CEOs, politicians, investors, people who pretended to be kind when eyes were on them, only to reveal their true nature when no one was looking. Naomi Carter wasn't playing a role. She was real. And that unsettled Eleanor more than anything. Because if Naomi was exactly who she seemed to be, then what excuse did Eleanor have to doubt her? The night had settled over Sterling Estate, wrapping the mansion in a hushed stillness that only came when the world outside had long surrendered to sleep. The grand halls, usually alive with the quiet symphony of footsteps, whispers, and distant laughter, now stood silent. The chandeliers above glowed softly, casting golden halos against the high ceilings, their light stretching long shadows across the marble floors. In the servants' quarters, tucked away at the back of the estate where the Sterling name held no weight, Eleanor Sterling sat in the dim glow of a single bedside lamp. She wasn't tired. Her mind had been running in relentless circles since dinner, since the tea, since Naomi Carter had looked her in the eye and shown nothing but grace. Eleanor had spent years perfecting the ability to see through people, to spot the small cracks in a person's performance. The the way a voice tightened ever so slightly when answering a question, the hesitation in a smile, the fleeting flicker of discomfort when someone pretended to be something they were not. Naomi had none of those cracks. That should have comforted Eleanor. It didn't. Because if Naomi was genuine, truly genuine, then Eleanor had to face something far more unsettling. That maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. And Eleanor Sterling was never wrong. Determined to prove what logic told her had to be true, Eleanor decided to dig deeper. She left her small, unfamiliar room in the servants' wing and moved silently through the darkened halls of her own home, her every step measured. If Naomi Carter was hiding something, Eleanor would find it. She had spent decades navigating the ruthless corridors of wealth and power. She knew how people operated, especially the ones who wanted something, because once upon a time, she had been one of them. A young black woman in a world that wasn't made for her, forced to prove herself 10 times over just to be seen. She knew what it was like to struggle, to dream of more, to crave the kind of life that seemed just out of reach, and she knew the lengths people would go to in order to secure it. So who was Naomi Carter? A woman in love or a woman with a plan? Eleanor moved with purpose, careful to remain unseen as she approached the guest wing where Naomi was staying. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to hear the soft murmur of voices inside. Juliana's voice and Naomi's. Eleanor hesitated for only a second before stepping closer, positioning herself in the shadows just outside the doorway. She wasn't proud of eavesdropping, but this wasn't about pride. This was about protecting her family. And then she heard something she hadn't expected. "I know your mother doesn't trust me," Naomi said softly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had known this battle before. "I could see it the moment I walked in." Juliana sighed, frustration laced in every syllable. "She doesn't trust anyone, Naomi. It's not about you." Naomi let out a quiet laugh, but it wasn't bitter. "I get it," she said. "She built an empire. She's worked her entire life to make sure you never had to struggle. And then suddenly I show up and she's supposed to believe that I'm not here for the money? That I love you for you?" Juliana's voice softened. "Because you do." There was a pause, a moment of quiet that felt heavier than the words themselves. Then Naomi spoke again, but this time, her voice carried something Eleanor didn't expect. "I didn't grow up with money," she admitted. "I know what it's like to count every dollar, to wonder if you'll make rent that month, to watch your mom work 2 jobs just so you can have the bare minimum. And I won't lie to you, Juliana, there was a time when I thought money was the answer. That if I just had enough, everything would be okay." Eleanor's breath stilled, because for the first time she heard a version of herself in Naomi Carter. "But then I met you," Naomi continued, her voice steady, "and for the first time I stopped thinking about survival, about proving myself, about chasing something that felt so far away, because with you I finally feel like I have everything I need." Juliana's voice cracked slightly. "Naomi," Eleanor closed her eyes. She had expected to hear whispers of strategy, manipulation, maybe even entitlement. Instead, she had heard truth, a truth she hadn't been ready to believe. Because if Naomi was telling the truth, then Eleanor had spent all this time testing a woman who had already proved herself just by loving her daughter. Eleanor exhaled slowly, stepping back from the door, retreating into the shadows once more. She had come here expecting to expose Naomi Carter's weaknesses. Instead, she had been forced to face her own. The morning light spilled through the grand windows of Sterling Estate, painting the marble floors in golden hues. The house was already alive with movement. Maids polishing silver, fresh linens being spread over the long dining table, the distant hum of conversation from the west wing. Eleanor Sterling stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching it all unfold. She had spent the night wrestling with the truth she hadn't wanted to face. Naomi Carter was not the enemy. She had heard it in her voice, seen it in her actions, felt it in the way Juliana looked at her. But knowing something and accepting it were 2 different things. For years, Eleanor had built walls around her family, fortresses of control, precision, and careful calculation. Love wasn't enough. Love could be manipulated. Love could be a lie. And yet, Juliana had found something real, something Eleanor had no control over. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the porcelain teacup she held. She wasn't ready to let go. not yet. So she had one last test, the kind that left no room for doubt. By midday, the estate was bustling in preparation for a charity luncheon Eleanor had planned weeks before. Montgomery Heights' most powerful socialites would arrive in a few hours, eager to sip champagne and write checks that would barely dent their fortunes. The house staff moved swiftly to ensure everything was flawless. And at the center of it all, Naomi. She had insisted on helping. Eleanor had watched as Naomi moved through the dining room, rolling up the sleeves of her blouse, carefully arranging place settings, adjusting floral centerpieces like she belonged there, like she wasn't just visiting, like she was home. Eleanor clenched her jaw. It was time. With quiet precision, Eleanor positioned a priceless Ming Dynasty vase, one of the estate's most treasured artifacts, on the very edge of a pedestal in the center of the hall. It was a calculated risk. A single nudge, the lightest accidental touch, and the vase would topple. She waited, and then, just as planned, Naomi walked by. A passing maid balancing a tray of crystal glasses stumbled slightly, just enough to brush against Naomi's arm. Naomi, caught off guard, took an instinctive step to the side, and her hip nudged the pedestal. The vase wobbled, tilted, and then, crash. The sound was deafening. The room froze. A million shards of blue and white porcelain lay scattered across the polished floor. Silence. Then, Margaret Pierce, the head housekeeper, stormed in. Her sharp eyes darted to the shattered remains, then to Naomi, who stood still, shock written across her face. What happened? Margaret's voice was tight, controlled. Eleanor stepped forward, her hands folded neatly in front of her, expression unreadable. This was it. Would Naomi deflect? Would she shift the blame? Would she shrink under the weight of expectation? Naomi took a slow breath, and then she did something Eleanor hadn't expected. She stepped forward and squared her shoulders. It was me, Naomi said, her voice steady. Eleanor's lips parted slightly. Margaret's gaze darkened. Miss Carter, do you have any idea how much that vase was worth? Naomi nodded. I do. Margaret sighed, already rubbing her temples. Mrs. Sterling is going to... I'll pay for it. Naomi's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Margaret hesitated. Miss Carter, I'll pay for it, Naomi repeated. Even if it takes me years, I'll work for it. I won't let someone else take the fall for my mistake. The words hung in the air. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor had nothing to say, because standing before her was not a woman who ran from responsibility, not a woman who saw wealth as an escape, not a woman who expected anything to be handed to her, but a woman of honor. And in that moment, Eleanor Sterling knew she had been wrong. The air inside Sterling Estate was impossibly still. The shattered remains of the Ming vase lay on the marble floor like a crime scene, the delicate blue and white fragments glistening under the warm chandelier lights. All eyes were on Naomi Carter, who stood tall despite the weight of what had just happened. The tension was suffocating. Eleanor Sterling had expected hesitation, excuses, some attempt to deflect responsibility. Instead, Naomi had done the opposite. She had claimed the mistake as her own. Not only that, she had offered to pay for it. Eleanor had spent her entire life reading people, peeling back their layers to reveal the truth beneath. And what she saw in Naomi now was something rare, something Eleanor had spent her whole life searching for, but never truly believed existed in a world like theirs. Integrity. Naomi's voice echoed in Eleanor's mind. Even if it takes me years, I'll work for it. There it was, proof. And yet, Eleanor had spent so much time building this test, crafting this moment, that she wasn't sure how to step back from it, how to let go of her own doubts, how to admit to herself that she had been wrong. A slow exhale left her lips. It was time. The next morning, a hushed murmur filled the grand hall of the estate. The entire staff had been gathered, lined up in neat rows, maids in crisp uniforms, butlers standing at attention, kitchen staff watching curiously from the side. They had been called here for a reason, but no one quite knew why. Naomi stood among them, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. And then, from the far end of the hall, Eleanor Sterling appeared. But this time, not as Ella James, as herself. She walked with the quiet command of a woman who owned the space she occupied. Her usual elegance was intact, her tailored dress, her diamond earrings, her posture that demanded attention without a single word. Gasps rippled through the room. Naomi stiffened. She didn't blink. She didn't step back. But Eleanor saw the shift in her eyes. The moment recognition dawned, the realization that the woman she had been speaking to, the woman who had spilled tea, the woman who had broken dishes and lingered in the background, was Eleanor Sterling all along. Juliana entered the room just as the silence stretched too thin. Her gaze snapped between her mother and Naomi. "What's going on?" Eleanor let the weight of the moment settle before she spoke. Her voice was steady. "Naomi, I owe you the truth." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Naomi's expression. "The truth?" Eleanor nodded once. "I was never a maid." Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or step back in betrayal. She simply watched, waiting. And somehow, that was worse. Eleanor inhaled deeply. "I needed to see you for who you really are. Not the version presented at dinner tables, not the version Juliana fell in love with, but the version you are when no one is watching." Naomi's jaw tightened slightly. Juliana took a step forward. "Mom, you..." Eleanor lifted a hand. "Let me finish." Her gaze returned to Naomi. "I had to know if you were here for the right reasons, if you were who you claimed to be." Naomi held Eleanor's stare, and then finally, she spoke. "And what did you find?" The challenge in her voice was quiet, but it was there. It was in the way she refused to break eye contact, in the way she stood her ground in front of the most powerful woman in the room. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "I found," she admitted, "that you are more than worthy of my daughter." A hush settled over the room. Naomi's lips parted slightly. Juliana's breath caught. Eleanor continued, her voice softer than before. "I put you through tests no one should have to face. I created moments designed to make you falter. I wanted to find a reason to doubt you, because that was easier than accepting that maybe, just maybe, my daughter had found something real." A beat of silence. Eleanor's next words weren't just for Naomi, they were for herself. "But the truth is, you didn't break under pressure. You didn't change depending on who was watching. And that is the rarest thing of all." Naomi swallowed hard. For the first time since Eleanor revealed herself, something flickered in Naomi's eyes that wasn't just strength. It was emotion. It was understanding. It was the quiet weight of being seen. The room remained still, the staff frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, Naomi nodded, not in acceptance, not in forgiveness, but in understanding. Eleanor Sterling had built walls around her family, but Naomi had walked through them, without force, without deception, without demand. She had simply been herself. And in the end, that was enough. The air inside the Sterling Estates Grand Hall felt heavier than usual, thick with the weight of unspoken words and emotions too raw to be disguised. The staff still stood in stunned silence, unsure of whether to remain or quietly slip away. Naomi Carter remained in place, her posture unwavering, her dark eyes locked onto Eleanor Sterling. She had just endured one of the most humiliating revelations of her life. To know that the woman she had shown kindness to, the maid she had helped clean up a broken vase, the one she had spoken to freely, with no filter or pretense, had never been a maid at all. She had been tested. Every moment had been a carefully placed obstacle. Every mistake, every accident, every seemingly random encounter, it had all been orchestrated. For what? To see if she was worthy? Naomi felt a tightness coil in her chest, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she did what no one expected. She let the silence stretch. She let Eleanor feel the weight of her own deception. And then, Naomi tilted her head ever so slightly. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm, measured. "And now that you've tested me," she said, her words cutting through the thick air like a blade, "do I pass?" Eleanor didn't answer right away, because this wasn't going how she had imagined. She had expected anger. Maybe even a wounded silence, a look of betrayal, a sharp retort about how cruel this had been. But instead, Naomi Carter was standing before her as an equal. She wasn't pleading for approval. She wasn't demanding an apology. She was simply waiting. Eleanor studied her, taking in every detail. The way her shoulders remained squared, unshaken. The steady rhythm of her breathing, controlled and deliberate. The fire in her eyes, not of defiance but of conviction. This was a woman who knew her worth, a woman who had nothing to prove. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time: respect. A slow breath escaped her lips. "You do," Eleanor finally admitted. Her voice, once cold steel, now carried something unmistakably real. Naomi didn't react right away. She simply held Eleanor's gaze for another moment, as if searching for any remaining trace of deception. Then she nodded. Not out of gratitude, not out of relief, but out of acknowledgement. Because Naomi had never needed Eleanor's approval, but she would accept her respect. A soft exhale came from the side of the room, Juliana. She had been watching the exchange unfold, her heart pounding, unsure of whether she should step in or let the moment play out. But now, as she looked between the two most important women in her life, she realized something. The battle was over. Not because one had won and the other had lost, but because somehow they had both laid down their swords. For the first time, Naomi turned to Juliana, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Juliana broke into a laugh, not out of humor, but out of sheer, overwhelming relief. Eleanor took a slow step forward, her voice softer now. "I put you through something you didn't deserve," she admitted, her words heavy with the weight of her own guilt. "And I won't ask you to forgive me for it, but know this, I do not give my respect easily." Naomi met her gaze, unreadable for a moment. Then, a quiet smirk. "Good," she said, "because neither do I." And just like that, the walls that had once separated them were no longer there. The weight of the confrontation still lingered in the air. The grand hall of Sterling Estate had never felt so small, so suffocating. Eleanor Sterling and Naomi Carter stood mere feet apart, their words sharp, measured, but undeniably honest, still echoing in the vast space. But there was one person who had yet to speak, Juliana. She had watched everything unfold like a spectator in a game she never agreed to play, her mother's deception, Naomi's unwavering dignity. The slow unraveling of a test that had been unnecessary from the start. And now, as the dust settled, all eyes turned to her, Naomi's, Eleanor's, the woman she loved, and the woman who had raised her. Her breath felt shallow in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Not the test, not the deception, but the day Eleanor Sterling would finally let someone else in. Juliana clenched her jaw, anger still simmering beneath her skin. She had spent her entire childhood watching her mother navigate life like a battlefield, never trusting, never believing that love could exist without an agenda. And now, even as Eleanor admitted she was wrong, it didn't erase the fact that she had done this in the first place. "Are you serious?" Juliana finally said, her voice breaking the silence. Eleanor turned to her daughter, her expression unreadable. "Juliana." "No," Juliana cut her off, shaking her head. "You tested her? You made her think she had to prove herself? That she had to pass some invisible standard to be good enough for me?" Eleanor's lips pressed together. "I needed to be sure." Juliana let out a bitter laugh, rubbing her hands over her face as she turned away for a second. She was furious, not just for Naomi, but for herself. Because deep down, this was always the expectation. That love was something that had to be proven, earned, measured, and she was exhausted. Naomi remained silent, watching her fiancé carefully. There was no anger on her face, no frustration, just understanding. Because Naomi knew this wasn't just about tonight. This was about every unspoken expectation Juliana had carried on her shoulders since she was old enough to understand what it meant to be a Sterling. Naomi reached out, gently placing a hand on Juliana's arm. "Hey," she murmured, soft but steady. Juliana turned toward her, and in that moment, the anger drained from her body. Because despite everything, Naomi was still here. She could have walked away. She could have thrown her hands up and decided that none of this was worth it. But she hadn't. She had stood her ground. She had fought for them. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Eleanor watched the way Juliana melted at Naomi's touch, the way her body softened, how her breathing evened out. She saw it. Love. Unfiltered, uncomplicated. Not love for wealth, not love for power, just love. And for the first time, she understood. Juliana turned back to Eleanor, her voice quieter now. "You didn't need to test her," she said, her eyes steady, "because she's not the one who needed to prove anything to you." Eleanor felt that, deeply, because Juliana was right. This wasn't about Naomi proving herself. It had never been. It had always been about Eleanor learning to let go. She inhaled slowly, letting the truth settle. Then, for the first time in her life, she did. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over Sterling Estate. Outside, the sky was painted in soft hues of amber and lavender, the air carrying the gentle hum of cicadas. It was the kind of evening that begged for quiet reflection, the kind that made even the grandest of estates feel small against the endless stretch of sky. Inside, the tension that had once filled the grand hall had dissipated, but something new had taken its place. Something fragile, something real. Eleanor Sterling stood on the terrace, a glass of wine in her hand, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't drinking it to quiet her thoughts. She was simply thinking. The weight of the last few days pressed against her ribs. Her test, her deception, her daughter's disappointment. And Naomi Carter, the woman she had underestimated at every turn. Eleanor wasn't used to being wrong. She had spent decades in control, shaping her world with sharp precision, ensuring that nothing and no one could jeopardize what she had built. But tonight, for the first time, she was forced to accept a truth she had long resisted. Love wasn't something you tested. Love was something you trusted. The sound of soft footsteps pulled Eleanor from her thoughts. She turned her head slightly and found Naomi standing a few feet away. She wasn't sure what she expected. Resentment, anger, maybe even a cold glance before she disappeared into Juliana's arms for the night. Instead, Naomi just looked at peace. She approached slowly, her hands tucked into the pockets of her loose-fitting slacks, the breeze playing with the loose tendrils of curls framing her face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Wine helps with guilt," she said, nodding toward the untouched glass in Eleanor's hand. Eleanor let out a quiet chuckle, surprising even herself. "It's not guilt," she admitted, swirling the deep red liquid. "It's acceptance." Naomi leaned against the stone railing, folding her arms as she studied Eleanor carefully. "That's new." Eleanor exhaled, glancing at her. "So are you." Naomi smiled, but it wasn't the smug kind. It was knowing, understanding. She had won, and they both knew it. But this wasn't a battle, not anymore. Eleanor set the glass down on the ledge beside her and turned fully toward Naomi. "You love my daughter," she stated. Naomi didn't hesitate. "With everything I have." Eleanor searched her face, looking for any trace of doubt, any hesitation. She found none. "And if I had said no?" Eleanor asked. "If I had told you I'd never accept you?" Naomi didn't blink. "I would have married her anyway." Eleanor felt something in her chest tighten, not with anger, but with something dangerously close to admiration. Naomi wasn't afraid of her. She had never been. Eleanor sighed, shaking her head. "You remind me of myself, you know." Naomi raised an eyebrow, amused. "Is that a compliment?" Eleanor smirked. "I haven't decided yet." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then, Eleanor straightened. "Walk with me." Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, falling into step beside her as they moved through the garden, the scent of blooming jasmine thick in the air. Eleanor kept her gaze forward. "I was wrong about you." Naomi glanced at her. "I know." Eleanor huffed out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "And you're not even going to let me say it, are you?" Naomi smiled. "You just did." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "You don't need my approval." Naomi nodded. "I don't." "But you have my respect," Eleanor continued, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice. Naomi's expression softened. That mattered more than any forced apology ever could. Eleanor took a deep breath, glancing toward the house where she could see Juliana watching them from the doorway, a cautious hope in her eyes. Eleanor had spent her entire life protecting her daughter, building walls so high that she had never considered what would happen when someone strong enough came along and refused to be shut out. Naomi hadn't climbed over those walls. She had simply stood on the other side, refusing to leave. And that was how Eleanor knew her daughter had found something real. She turned back to Naomi. "Welcome to the family," Eleanor said. The words carrying the weight of years of control finally being released. Naomi exhaled, her smile genuine. "Thank you," she said, but they both knew she had never needed the invitation. And there you have it, proof that true character isn't revealed in words, but in actions. Eleanor thought she was testing Naomi, but in the end, she was the one who had to learn the hardest lesson. Trust isn't built through control, it's built through truth, respect, and the willingness to see people for who they truly are. Now let me ask you, how often do you judge people before truly knowing them? How many opportunities, friendships, relationships, even life-changing moments have you pushed away just because you were afraid to trust? What if the very thing you've been resisting is exactly what you need? Let's talk about it in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. And if you don't want to miss more powerful stories like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's so much more to uncover, so many lessons waiting for you. Hit that subscribe button now, and let's keep learning together.